Welcome, welcome, friends. My name is Shinay Trudeau, and I'm here again with Bhavani Maki for another episode of the Yogi's Roadmap podcast. We are so glad you are choosing to spend your time with us today. A deep Bhavani, welcome back. I'm overjoyed to be here with you.
Thanks, Shanae. It's great to see you too.
So, my questions today have to revolve around the feminine principle in yoga. And I was intrigued when you first told me of what Krishnamacharya had said or written about, I don't remember, about women inheriting yoga. As a previously predominantly masculine discipline, what is your experience of the feminine principle in yoga?
Yeah, that's a nice open question, and it's a great question. Um, yeah, so we have to realize because we tend to we're so myopic, right? So we can only remember so far back. And I'm going to circle around this question and see where it goes. But it's really wonderful. Nico's finally at the age where he's enjoying programs such as Nova, and we have a whole stack of them listed. And he said, let's watch the one that says when whales could walk. And there's this incredible, yeah, it's really fascinating. This incredible archaeological park in Egypt where there was something like 20,000. I mean, it was a massive number, 20,000 whale skeletons completely intact, all with feet. And it talks about how the whales, they lived in the ocean, then they became terrestrial. And then as the ages changed, they went back into the ocean. So how far back can we really go? When we're looking within our own kind of like 2 degrees of separation folklore, at least for me, where Krishnamacharya was my teacher's teacher, right? So that's not that far away, is it? I think when did Krishnamacharya leave his body? Maybe in the, I don't know, was it in the
20s?
80s? Was it? No.
Okay. No, it wasn't that
We got to
far.
look that up, but it wasn't that far ago, that long ago. Um, so, within his own era, and he coming on the heels basically of, the hijack that I talk about, right,
Yes,
was the Vedic period. So
right.
about 2000, it started like 2000 BCE to maybe 150 BCE. And that's when, and then before that was like the pre-Aryan period. So, we only have like limited understanding of what was happening, but let's say like the Vedic period was when there was like this restructuring of yoga that we consider to be classical yoga.
Yeah.
That's when there was a big shift. And, I was kind of just doing a little bit of research on it before our meeting today. And it was talking about how women were considered to be unclean. And I even remember, it's interesting, even with like Krishnamacharya, who was such a luminary in that he did teach women because women were considered unclean. At the same time, when I was like in India with his student Patabi Joyce, and after many trips and being invited, being kind of part of their family. I mean, I was invited to the village and we took a nap on the floor together, on our kusha mats, on our vetiver mats. And, I was really like, became a Western daughter of the family. And then one year I was even invited to stay in what, they had houses, they became affluent, to stay in one of their houses. But I was told, however, when you're menstruating, you're going to have to go to a hotel.
Wow.
So I was like, I think I'll just find my own place. You know what I mean? But it was like, you're welcome to stay with us, but when you have your period, you can't stay. And, so it was really curious. I was like doing a little research on it. And, from this my one of my favorite books. I mean, it's the pair of books. I let you read them when you were staying here, The Hindu World.
Yeah.
And it speaks about during that Vedic period that a woman, what was it like during her menstrual cycle, it was like the second day of her menstrual cycle, it's like you treat her, she is as impure as if she had killed a Brahmin. Like just unbelievable, and I know that from my personal experience. So even though like Krishnamacharya made this huge leap in allowing women to practice yoga and even teaching them postures that would help them to um, resist implantation of an embryo as a form of birth control, there was still this intense context of misogyny. It's just kind of like, and honestly, it's everywhere.
Yeah.
There's a few societies, like I know there's matriarchal societies in I think in Gabon in Africa where the women really hold the control. So in some ways, he made large steps forward as far as teaching women and even going so far as to say that women were more trustworthy. I mean, we can certainly track the matrilineal lineage much more accurately than
Mhm.
we could through the patriarchal lineage because it's obvious, who's coming out of where.
Yeah.
And that women spent time with the children. And so, of course, during those early years is when samskaras are really put into place.
Mm.
So that was really, kind of breaking the glass ceiling, but only to a certain extent. Now, if you go to the pre Vedic period, which is like the pre Aryan period, um, there's a whole different paradigm. And women had thread ceremonies. They had sutra ceremonies where they received their thread and they were tied to God. They were educated. They were able to perform certain rituals, even certain, transmissions came through these women. And interestingly enough, I mean, I've looked for them. There's very little annotated. Where are these rishikas? These aboriginal, they were aboriginals. Okay. So then you can think about the Aryans coming in and there being a power flip that happened. So these women have kind of like been relegated to the shadows. And it was even considered that, there was yoni worship. And there were rituals in which the yoni was there either as some kind of like a murti, a representation, a stone or something, or an actual woman sat there and her yoni was worshipped. And the yoni was considered to be one of the mouths of Brahma, of God, that represented the shunya or the mystical opening, the zero in which all possibilities were there. It was like the portal into the mysteries. And it was said that you should sip the wisdom of Brahma's second mouth. So there was like this whole other paradigm that happened. And it's just really interesting because, this is something where, for instance, my mother, this has really become her dharma. Where are the pieces of history that have been forgotten? And she's actually, a historian that goes into archives and finds things and, has changed where she lives in order to do that, to go into microfiche and ship records and also our own family records and to start to like pull these threads because of course who's writing the history books, there's a massive agenda. So, like trying to find these threads and it's so interesting, like even in this encyclopedic um, survey of Hinduism, you'll find a layer here, and then you'll find another layer somewhere else under another um, what do you call it? Like another section of the book, you look up this word. And I remember, and what, it's one of those books which I just love to open and read into. And it was speaking about how even, there was a period, and I'm assuming it was pre-Vedic, maybe it was who really knows, where women were allowed to have extramarital relationships as long as their husband was out of town. I want to know, what if the wife's out of town? Is that allowed? Anyway, never mind. The husband's out of town, and as long as she had a menstrual cycle before he returned, it wasn't considered to be an infraction or an infringement up on their monogamy. And we can even see the introduction later of the choli, right? The really tight little underblouse, which acts like a bra.
Mm-hmm.
So that was something that was introduced later. And I'm sure maybe you've seen this in India. I would see it sometimes, the widows, and they're widows because they shave their head.
Yeah.
That's one indication. And then white being the funereal color. It's not black. And so they wear a white sari, their heads are shaved, and they don't wear the choli, so they're bare-breasted underneath. So it's really interesting to see. And again, it's like when whales could walk, what are all of these eras? And then you put a date on some of these things. And I know for me, where it's a known fact that I really struggle with time. It's dyschrometria or whatever it is, with my dyslexia, I really struggle with it. But the whole construct of, when you start to think like 30,000 years ago is when the first people were living in the Indus Valley. And then and there was like the Stone period, and then there was the Stone Age period, and then there was the Bronze Age, and then it wasn't until the Iron Age in which there was the Vedic period. But really, these rishi and this rishika were aboriginal.
Mm-hmm.
And we can think about that. It's like you only need one dude.
Yeah.
You need a lot of women in order for the tribe or for the group to be able to proliferate. So it's very fascinating. I will say the misogyny that I experienced in India was terrible.
Yeah.
I mean, it's where we maybe idolize or like, have these rosy ideas around India, but I also see it's really prevalent here too. I see the way that what women do to themselves to maintain this, I'm still fertile, I'm still attractive kind of an attitude or representation of themselves. So that is something that is ubiquitous on the planet, is the disrespect that's given to the sacred mother.
Yeah.
It's not something, look, it's like nothing's all good and nothing's ashukla or a Krishna. It's not all good, and it's not all good, and it's not all bad. It's mixed. But I definitely had to advocate for myself as a woman sometimes in India with my teachers, and I even remember arguing with Patabi Joyce sometimes, and he'd be like, do it this way, like Mayurasana, and I was
Yeah.
like, you don't have breasts, Guruji. You don't know what you're talking about. And he was like, oh, I mean, there were certain things where it was like literally there were different adjustments that needed to be made because of the female form and because of the way we're put together. And that being said, historically, the Ashtanga Vinyasa was for young Brahmin boys. It was kind of like a military, it had strands of the British military calisthenics that had come into it. I mean, this idea of it coming the Yoga Karunta, and it's this ancient text. Maybe, I don't know. It probably was some kind of a template that they worked from. So it is interesting, how I've had to adjust my practice. I think it's pretty intuitive, right? It's like in some ways there was grace because you weren't allowed to go practice in the shala. Now that I know, because you were as impure as if you had killed a Brahmin during that. No one mentioned that part, right? But there was like, okay, what do I need? And what does my body need? And how can I work with that? And then I do know some women who would just power through
Mhm.
their menstrual cycle. And
Mhm.
like athletes, when
Mhm.
the body is really, really taxed, the body almost starts like absorbing and you lose the menstrual cycle. Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you have other questions about that? Because I'm not sure I answered your question. I
Oh,
gave
that was fantastic. I found he did live until the 80s. So in this book,
thoughts.
The Heart of Yoga by TKV Desikachar, um, Krishnamacharya lived to be over 100 years old. So he was teaching in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 1970s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. So just wanted to
Yeah,
clarify.
but I mean, that's not that far. You were alive, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I was definitely alive. I was, I was like in high school.
Yeah.
Um, had I known, right, to go over there and it's amazing to think that, like, wow, here was this grace master and we lived during the same time.
Yeah.
But yeah, there was just so much misogyny, and I remember studying. I think I shared this with you once. I would go study with my Samskrita teacher, and he he lived in the most charming little house. I mean, it had kind of like a tile roof and a straw roof, and it was like a hands constructed house in Mysuru, with the clay kind of a house and the clay floors, and like a little room for the Sanskrit classes. He was Narayanacharya. He was a retired professor, and so he was just kind of teaching a little bit, whoever wanted to take lessons. I think my monthly fees were, what was it, like 100 or 200 rupees a month, and I would
That's two
come.
dollars.
Yeah, $2. I would come 5 days a week.
Mm.
There were expectations.
Yeah.
You didn't just show up to class. Like, you had to be writing the matrikas and writing out the Gita verses and memorizing them. And even though you didn't know, like, you just dove in head first, you just started doing it through mimicry and slowly learned it. And one day, it was interesting because it was this gentleman named Greg, who is from New Zealand. And he was like, really, he'd been there a lot of years. Every time he would come, he would study with the professor. And then there was this local woman who was learning English, and he was teaching her from like Pride and Prejudice. Like, oh my gosh, like, that's difficult for me to read, right?
Yeah.
That kind of
Yeah.
like level of
Yeah.
Victorian English. So, and on that day, I was the only student who showed up, and there was the table that was seated, like usually he would sit on one side and I would sit on the other, and the two students. But because I was the only student, he sat in a different position because it would be inappropriate for him to sit across from me.
Huh.
And as we're going through the shravana, the chanting, and the call and response, etc., his wife, who was this tiny little thing, and she was also always sweeping, right, sweeping the clay floor, so she, really low to the ground. And as we're chanting, I heard she was chanting with us. So she's like, Dhritarashtra vacha dharma kshetre kurukshetre samaveta yuyutsava. And I said, Professor, you taught your wife? You also taught your wife? And he said, Talk to my wife. Talk to my wife. I am never talking to my wife. Only for marital responsibilities. Only for making children. After that, I am not talking to her. So she had been a student of his
Wow.
just through proximity,
Wow.
but he completely
Yeah.
wouldn't even recognize her, or he didn't see her anything beyond being somebody who was going to clean for him and cook for him
Mm.
and bear him children. And it
Wow.
was just like, wow, meanwhile, he's teaching me this Howley, this Gauri, this foreign white woman. And interestingly enough, from what I understand, that's how it started with Krishnamacharya.
Oh,
It was Indra Devi, and she was like this bohemian. Have you read her?
I
Did you read?
haven't. No, I've just heard stories of her.
It was a great story. And she was the kind, I think she was like Russian or something, or Eastern
Mm.
European. And she was part of this bohemian kind of a, Madame Blavatsky kind of a crowd. So they were these bohemes, and they had salons, and they were doing poetry. And I think she was kind of a dancer. She was just a nonconformist kind of on this gypsy adventure, and ends up in India. And then Maharaja Wodyawar, I have a hard time saying his name, who had the Mysore palace. He was very what's the word, international. He would host these illustrious affairs and have people come in, and that's when he would call in he wanted Krishnamacharya to teach yoga there. He had a scene going on. It was a hep and happening scene. And then they would have these late parties, and he'd be like, "Oh, I want a yoga demonstration. Send a little chariot and some horses." And Krishnamacharya was like, "Oh, get my student Patami Joyce." And he would do these, like circus act. Isn't that funny? I never put that together
I've never
because
heard that.
because Patami Joyce used to always say yoga is not a circus, and yet he was kind of a circus animal for
Yeah.
Wodyawar and his
Mm.
illustrious international guests. And I guess Indra Devrik kind of floated into the Mysore palace, and Krishnamacharya was there and teaching, and she wanted to be taught, and he was like, "I don't teach women." So he actually rejected her,
Wow.
and she kept pushing, and then finally I guess he did, and that's what really put him on the map.
Mm.
Now, I hadn't thought about this. Is a great conversation
Yeah.
because she's the one who kind of put him on the map. As far as like I'm
Mhm.
making assumptions,
Right.
I'm drawing
Sure.
making connections, but really, it's the person who's willing to take cross the line,
Yeah. Yeah.
break the rule that's of interest, break the glass ceiling. So he was reticent. He didn't want to. And I don't think he was teaching Indian women necessarily, but that Western woman pushed him. And then he started saying, and then he started teaching his daughters and his
Mm.
granddaughters, etc.
Wow. And where did that phrase come from where he said this thing about, yoga being inherited by women?
Well, yeah, I'd have to look a little bit. Is it is it in Heart of Yoga? I have a
It
few
might, it
books.
might be. It might be in here. I'd have to look again.
You know, you're asking me questions of like, I've been doing, 35, 40 years of reading and studying. So it's all kind of like
Yeah.
sequestered in the
Yeah.
annals of my brain. It might be in the Yoga Karunta.
Yep.
There's a wonderful book called The Yoga of the Yogi by Kaustubh Deskachar.
Yeah.
Have you read that one? Uh,
No.
They're worth rereading. I mean, I'm glad you're saying that. I feel
Yeah.
like I could reread some of these. Um, but it's in there. It's in
Yeah.
there. It's documented. You know, he said
Yeah.
they were more trustworthy,
Yeah.
and they were also the ones who were around. You know, they're the natural. Um, oh, here's another great one: disseminators, right?
Mhm.
Even though we're
Yeah.
inseminated, we're the
Yeah.
disseminators.
Yeah. Was it you that told me that story? I heard somewhere that, walking into the temples, and which is so interesting to me because I've been to India, and walking into the temples, and there's feminine worship all over the place. Like it's so juicy and so feminine. And the Shiva Lingam with the yoni is like a thing, it's like the masculine and feminine counterparts are are portrayed in these huge stone images with flowers and milk and honey poured on them. And then, so someone was telling me this story about how walking into a temple, and there was this stone carving of women, and from women came the whole line. And then at the very end was a man who no longer continued that birth process because men can't birth babies. But it was like that, matriarchal line all the way until there was a man. And it was like that image just stuck with me for so long. And then I'm always curious, like, what happened? What happened when the devotion is there to the divine feminine, and yet in reality,
Right. I mean, I that wasn't from me.
mm,
I didn't see that.
mm,
But yeah, and this is again like when whales could walk.
yeah, yeah,
So we're going to go back in the ocean. We're going to come out of the ocean. We're going to go back where we are all myopic to some degree. We don't see the whole picture, and it's only supposition. And perhaps there was, there's that tendency when when somebody has power, absolute power corrupts absolutely. I remember learning that
mm.
from my teacher, my social studies teacher, Mr. Nestor, in like the seventh grade. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. So it's very possible that that's what happened, and how long we're going to be going into these extremes. And what we learned yesterday in the Yoga Sutra mentorship, Heturpala Ashrayata Lambanai Sangritatva Deshamabhave Tatapavaha. The wheel keeps
Mhm.
spinning as
Mm,
long as there is as long as there is pleasure and pain and attraction and avoidance and striving for power and being disempowered, that wheel keeps turning. But as soon as you take away the ground, which is one of the extremes, the other one doesn't have a substratum to live in. So, how many times are we going to be doing this dance? This is what turns the wheel of evolution. It's not all bad. It's not all good. Um, we just don't know. But I think it's important that we take pause
yeah.
and take wonder, because we're only ever seeing just a little bit.
Mm. Has there ever been a time for you that you needed to reframe your point of view from maybe a more masculine approach to a more feminine approach? For example, like you were saying in the physical asana, needing to make certain adjustments for women, we have breasts, we have different shaped pelvises, things like that.
Yes.
Yes.
All the time. I mean, even the way that our body changes so much hormonally, things that I could do pre when you look at the phases of a woman, right? There was the phase where I was non-gravitas, right? Where I hadn't had a baby or wasn't pregnant, and I had a very lithe kind of a body. I mean, my pelvis was tiny. I was really tiny. I was really narrow. It's kind of crazy when I
Mm.
think about like how much my body has changed over time. And so, um, interestingly enough, like one of the poses that Krishnamacharya taught for the birth control, which was that Hashasana,
Mm.
like there's just, or even Marichyasana D, or even Parivrita Parshvakonasana,
Yeah.
it's like my ability to get my belly around and get my femur into the back of my armpit and then clasp my hands, like that just ain't happening. It would be a great birth control if it was an issue. um but also, yeah, there's a lot of considerations, and um particularly also like the types of asanas that we do are going to shift so much. We all, anybody who's worked within our tradition knows that as we get older, it's really about those endocrine postures. Salamba Sarvangasana, right? The way that it accesses the pineal gland and the pituitary gland and Shirshasana, and even being able to do it supported. And the beauty of it is that there's just so much more nuance, which I really feel has been lost
Mhm.
a lot. Maybe in that period, I almost want to call it like the dark ages, the middle ages, and the Vedic period could be part of that, where women were disempowered. How much of it was lost because women weren't allowed to be taught, and there was less of that internal awareness. And so that's where, quite frankly, when all my teachers have passed, when I want to learn deeper yoga, I'm not studying with yoga teachers. I just had the incredible gift of doing a 3-day workshop with Mary Bond this past weekend. And she started as one of Ida Rolf's senior students, and then kind of, and it's very interesting to see that too in the Rolfing community. There's people who are really fundamentalist about it must be done this way and you must stick to the original recipe. And so there's schism within that community of like who's sticking to the original teachings with the original teachers and who are the ones who have made discoveries on their own.
Mhm.
And when you look at the older students of hers, most of them, they're having their own discoveries. How could they not? Right? So she's going to this whole other level of nuance. And it was amazing her to hear. You have these like the very devoted classical students of these OG teachers. And she was pretty subdued, but then she kind of got excited. And she said, "You realize she didn't know everything. You realize she was a Victorian.
Yeah.
Like she had mojo and she was a pioneer, but she didn't see it all."
Yeah.
And so then, she was, and fortunately, Mary, she does yoga as well. Some of these Rolfers, they're like totally against yoga. It's like, I mean, it's just so interesting how this person's against that and this person's against that. And like, where's the overlap? Like, it's not all unuseful and it's not all useful. But so much of my yoga practice has been learning. And one thing that I love that she said, because we're learning about functional movement, and really the project is to help the person
Mm.
to feel better in their body,
Mhm.
to feel like they have more choices, that they don't have to struggle so hard just to be in their body. So it's a reframing and it's very nuanced. And that's the project, not trikonasana, or not even that you're in line and you have perfect symmetry, etc. It's a deconstruction. And she said, well, it's like anything, you have to have foundation. You either start, maybe it's the foot. You're looking at this person's foundation. Where is their foot? Where is their pelvis? And where is their belief system? So all these belief systems that we've been given in yoga, the pose must be done this way.
Mm.
And then you see like the Iyengar yogis and their shoulders are pinned back.
Yeah.
And, like, oh my God, like really, like that's where the belief system becomes the structure, and we're missing the point. The whole, like, yoga doesn't need us.
Yeah.
We need yoga. Is this yoga working for my body? And it's been so fascinating because I've been raised in this lineage of yoga, and no, it's not all bad, but let me tell you, it is not all good. And there's this intense prevalence that we see with a lot of classically trained yoga practitioners, where they don't have natural curves in their spine. They've lost the curves. And then you have other extremes where people are just completely hanging on their curves,
Mm.
and where you're not just doing some arbitrary movement. You're this person creating arbitrary movement. This is where the sutra are so juicy, but you're actually moving in a matrix.
Mm.
So water has a thicker kind of a viscous quality, but the matrix we're moving in is space and the gravitational field. And so what is the goal of yoga is effortlessness, right? Yeah. So it's really fascinating. So, it's like, I'm like, if I'm going to learn more yoga, I'm actually not going to learn from most yoga teachers because
Right.
it's the same shit. Just, oh my God. And, there's some that I might learn from that are interesting to me. But for the most part, I just feel like it's almost like it's become so puritanical.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's almost not yoga at that point, because I also feel, I need outside input. Like, I need my writing teachers and my dance teachers. It's like that's all feeding this whole thing. And yet it can get very narrow, very pinched, very dogmatic, very quickly.
That's it, and it just, look, there's nothing casual about it.
Yeah.
And yet at the same time, like, seeing where people have taken the fun out of functional.
Yeah.
We really learn through play and through exploration and taking an idea and like, well, what does that feel like? And what does that do? And, we actually, the most functional movement that we have happens through polarities.
Mhm.
So that's where it's not this and it's not that, and there's just a lot of juice there, and it is a learning game. um yeah, so I feel like that maybe is much more actually kind of, if we can titrate this down, maybe that is more of a feminine way as well, isn't it? Where we're actually wired that way, where we were the gatherers and we moved in groups, and while the males were the hunters, and they have their vision is much more, um what's the word, is there a word, monocular, where
Ah,
they can see a target and they can do a single task like go get meat,
yeah.
and there's the target and you can shoot the arrow. Women have a different kind of visual field which interestingly enough is actually how drishti, from what I understand, is meant to be. And I've
Mm,
seen students who do Nasagai drishti, and it's like you could just feel the tension. They're like literally trying to stare at the tip of their nose. Oh my God, that gives me a headache.
yeah.
Instead, it's more of like a soft,
Mm,
real focus. So, Nirodha, expanding. I mean, you're coming into your third trimester. You realize it's all about expanding, and it's all about giving new birth to creation. It's a very different energy. And let's not misconstrue to say this, that one is better than the other. But when things get extreme in one direction, we kind of got to go, okay, where's the balance here? You know,
yeah,
balance isn't static.
right.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great. That's really great. And how has your, or anything else you want to say about how your practice and your teaching might have changed with becoming both a wife, a mother, and now moving into your wisdom years?
Well,
You got another 3 hours? Oh.
yeah. I mean, it's a work in progress, right? I mean, there's so many. It's kind of like when whales could walk again. Maybe that's going to be the title,
I think
even though
so.
Nova already took it.
It's okay. We're
You
gonna
think
borrow it.
we're small potatoes? Maybe we could do that. But, looking back, and even like, there's like that sense of the vinyasa. There's this week, and where am I at? Or there was like 2 weeks ago, like riding those eclipses or riding astrological. We who are Aries have been getting hammered by Chiron. There's like epochs within your life. There's epochs within your day.
Mm,
Um, but I would say, one of my favorite adjustments, because I was so heavy
mm,
when I had Nico.
mm.
Um, and the women in my family get really big, and that on top of the fact that I was being pumped with progesterone because I kept miscarrying, and they give that to cancer patients
Oh,
to help them maintain an appetite.
yeah.
So I was just huge, 108-pound weight gain,
Mm.
huge. So I remember finally giving birth to Nico, and I'm like, oh yeah, I'm gonna get my body back now. Right. And women, I think we do ourselves a misservice in that, like, while you're nursing, you're basically still pregnant. Your
Mm,
body hormonally is still pregnant. So
mm,
that's something to consider. And there's a lot of pressure, like have the baby, pump it out, get it back. You're never going to get it back the way it was. And that's okay. Your pelvis is going to be different. And I remember even Patabi Joyce saying that for women, like their postures aren't really like totally correct, whatever that means, until they've given birth. That's a really
wow.
interesting thing. Like the pelvic floor opens. I wish I'd asked him more about that.
Yeah.
Um, but I think it's true. Like a woman's pelvis is kind of like, God, and please, for those women who wanted to have babies and haven't, please don't don't hurt yourself with this.
Yeah.
But your pelvis just changes,
Yeah.
so it reaches kind of a different. And some women, you can really see where their pelvis, they have dysplasia.
Hmm.
I've seen women who have had a lot of babies, and it's like their pelvis feels really loose. And then I also remember there were a lot of like Ashtanga Vinyasa women practitioners who had a hard time pushing out their babies because they were taught Mula Bandha was this intense contraction of the perineum,
Yeah.
which is a gross oversimplification and creates lots of problems. But yeah, so I was like, okay, I'm going to do my first Surya Namaskara, and there was just no way.
Yeah.
I was so heavy. My
Yeah.
ass was so big. My legs were so big, and everything was so big.
Yeah.
And so I could barely support myself. And I pulled out a chair, pulled out a bolster, and I did supported shoulder stand.
Mm.
Then had the amazing discovery that I could nurse in that position. And literally that pose, I mean, it works with the endocrine system.
Mhm.
Like I just started draining water, all the like the fluid started coming out of my body, and I lost a significant amount of weight,
Mm.
which it wasn't about the number, but it was just about hauling ass, you know?
Yeah.
And I wanted to feel lighter. And then also, oh God, it was just magical doing
Mm.
Nadi Shodhana, the alternate nostril breathing and nursing. Like I
Wow.
could do pranayama and I could just feel like as I was doing the pranayama, that part of that stream was just going right into Nico, you know, as he was
Mm.
like pulling the prana through me.
Mm.
It's wonderful. It's
Mm.
wonderful to take. It's like sitting back in your rocking chair and looking at all these phases. And I feel so appreciative that I had that strong practice at a certain point in my life. It's then, you know, the belief system behind it. And then when it's no longer working for you, the pain of having to deconstruct that belief system, be like, okay, I'm trying to get pregnant. I can't do these birth control postures anymore. I got to put on weight. I got to eat. And then I want to go back to that. No, that's not happening. Um, and then we have a tidal and seasonal rhythm to our bodies.
Mm.
Isn't that what the yoga is about? That we can pay attention to that and make the adjustment in our belief system.
Mhm. I think that's really the what you're speaking to is the feminine principle, is that seasonal and tidal rhythm. It's like really honoring that. And for me, there was a time where I did lose my menses, and I was practicing so hard that, it was just like, and then everything broke, including myself, my relationships, everything, just because I was just trying to go so strong and so hard without recognizing the natural ebb and flow.
And really, that's where it's kind of like we have to we learn through extremes.
Hmm.
So even though we're doing something extreme that isn't good for us,
Yeah.
it's kind of like the addict. They have to hit a bottom before they go, wow, like am I like this is I can't sustain this. I gotta do something different, you know? So I think that's where all the, Patanjali is very clear. It's like, be careful of the extreme natures. That's an oscillation within itself.
Mm.
Um, so it's all an act to self-realize.
Mhm.
We're going to have to get there eventually and have acceptance, for our limits and see where we can grow and where we can get interested. And that's like the nuance. There's just endless nuance. That's so wonderful.
Yay. The last thing I wanted to ask you is, what are some of your favorite yoga books written by women or translated by women?
Ooh, well,
And
definitely Rama's books.
yeah,
And she managed to put 3 books out.
Rama,
Yoga
Jyoti,
books.
Virgin.
Vernon.
Vernon.
You
Thank
just
you.
called her a virgin.
Did
She
I
was
call-
definitely.
She's not a virgin. I was like,
Hang
Virgin
on, let me look
Mary,
a little bit here.
Vernon, Rama, Jyoti, Vernon. Hmm.
See. Um,
Do you like Nischala Joy Davies' book?
I do. Thank you for mentioning that. Yes,
Yeah.
I really like her book a lot. Let's see. I guess I should have looked at that a little bit closer.
That's
Um,
okay.
yeah, favorite books.
Well, and of course, I'll put a plug for Bhavani's book. If you don't have one already, our dear listeners, get yourself a
Yeah.
copy of the Yogi's Roadmap.
I'd have to look a little bit deeper. I mean, there's so many books that are out there now that I don't know.
Yeah.
Do you have any that you particularly like?
That's why I was asking because those are the only few that I know, but we can put it in the show notes. We can put our
Yeah,
heads together and
I'll have to think about that
yeah.
a little bit deeper. But I really like Mary Bond's writings
Mm-hmm.
on functional movement. I think they're really, really fascinating. Um, Yeah, I'd have to look a little bit deeper. I'm not that hip to the things that have been written that are out there.
Yeah.
And yeah, I'd have to look a little bit deeper. I mean,
Um,
Mariana Caplan wrote a great book, Eyes Wide Open. I think that was really a
yeah.
great one. That came on the heels of my training, so it's full of Yoga Sutra stuff, and you can just see the thread that's in there.
Yeah.
Um, Yeah, I'd have to think about that a little bit more. But definitely Rama's books are wonderful.
Yeah.
They're fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anything else you want to add about this feminine principle? Maybe we'll revisit in future episodes because I just feel like it's such a juicy conversation.
Perhaps if we were to, if we were going to draw like from these aboriginal strands of the Rishi and the Rishika, we know they were there. It's like even remember reading somewhere that it's like enlightenment has to come through a woman. You're
Hmm.
either born from a woman, married to a woman's your sister, a woman's your daughter. So, like, nobody's here. We're all here because of each other. We need each other. Is that yoga is clearly described as fluid, fluency, an internal experience, an experience of dilation. Um, It's about looking into the shadow. It has that yin nature. So it's just very interesting, as far as like these extremes where women are predominantly occupying yoga classes and they're mostly yoga teachers. Like in my generation, there were very few women yoga teachers. But it's mostly inhabited by women, and it's often very contractive. It's almost like women trying to be men
Yeah. Yeah.
to get more men or whatever. And I don't know. And of course, I'm stereotyping and generalizing. So these are gross, sweeping statements. But yeah, the experience is one of dilation, and that, it's the mystery. We learn through Prakriti, and Prakriti is that feminine principle that is creative, infinitely creative. That is the evolutionary process. And as I learned in that documentary, When Whales Could Walk, evolution takes a really long time.
Mhm.
And it's more about letting go. Evolution, these are like major pundits in science. Evolution is actually letting go of what doesn't work.
Mm. Mm.
That's how you evolve. Isn't that interesting?
Such relief in that. Like, oh, right. Oh, yeah, of course.
And doesn't that smack of Tivra Samvegana Masnaha?
Yeah.
You're not going to carry, like, why carry stuff that isn't working for you? That's where you have to really sit, be self realize.
Hmm.
That's not working for me.
Yeah.
Maybe it will in the future.
Yeah.
It's not working for me right now. Hatha yoga.
Thank you so much, Bhavani Ma. Such a joy and a pleasure.
Thank you, Shinay.
Till next time.
Ahui ho, aloha.